Welcome to Expiscore, the weblog of Stephen Hall, Director General of the WorldFish Center. In these blogs, Steve gives his personal reflections on current topics and areas of debate in the realm of fish and development. In this blog, Steve talks about ocean acidification and the future of mollusks and the implications this might have for food security.
In my last blog, I pointed out that most of the food produced by farming the sea is molluscs. That's about 2/3 of the world's global mollusk production, to which we have to add the supply that comes from wild fisheries. Not only are these supplies important for those of us in developed countries who enjoy the luxury of eating oysters and mussels, but they're also critical to the income, food, and nutrition security of many, particularly in Southeast and East Asia. That shellfish farming and fisheries production might be under threat from climate change may be a surprise to some of you, but it's not a surprise to marine chemists who've shown both in laboratory and field studies that changes in atmospheric CO2 lowers the pH of the oceans, and that this increased acidity makes a crucial difference for animals that build hard shells or skeletons. These animals find it difficult because when seawater becomes more acidic, the concentrations of carbonate fall. That means that the animals have to spend more energy to take up the chemical and deposit the shells or skeletons that they need. And that in turn means that they've got less energy to devote to growth and reproduction. And this doesn't just mean that these animals simply grow a little less. It can also reduce the size of populations. Analysis of a long-term data set from the United States, for example, has shown how mollusk populations have changed in response to fluctuations in pH. Well, that's all very well, but is the size of the likely impact really something we should worry about? That's the question that Sara Cooley and her colleagues asked in a recent paper, where they examine how climate-driven changes in ocean acidification might affect the long-term prospects for global mollusk production and the likely impact of these changes on food security. The approach they took was to first look at today's mollusk production, consumption and export, and ask how vulnerable producer countries are to changes in production and how easily they could adapt and cope with these changes. They then looked at present and future surface ocean chemistry forecasts and identified transition decades for different regions of the world. These are decades when future ocean chemistry will be distinctly different from today. The basic idea is that countries with low adaptability, high nutritional or economic dependence on molluscs, and rapidly approaching transition decades or rapidly growing populations will be the most vulnerable to declines in mollusk supply that are driven by ocean acidification. Several important predictions arise from this work. The first is that some of the regions in which demand for molluscs is likely to rise the most are also regions where future acidification effects are likely to come soonest. The countries of the Western Pacific and the Northeastern Pacific, the USA and Canada, fall into this category. Of course, countries like the USA and Canada will no doubt be able to cope with these effects, albeit perhaps at some cost to the aquaculture industry and to consumers. You might be paying a little bit more for your oysters. In contrast, and more worryingly, the authors also found that many of the countries that are most vulnerable and least able to adapt to mollusk declines, the countries of South and Southeast Asia and East Africa, are also in regions where transition decades are likely to arrive early. Some of these can expect problems within the next 15 years and will need to start thinking about coping strategies now. Among the strategies that these vulnerable countries can adopt, supporting local people to invest in viable mollusk aquaculture enterprises may be one of the most fruitful. They can do this, for example, by ensuring appropriate planning and environmental policies are in place, and providing technical support and extension services, infrastructure to connect producers to markets, and access to credit. Encouraging local mollusk farming in these countries is a promising strategy for two reasons. First, it removes dependency on the unpredictable and uncontrollable fluctuations that are likely to occur in wild populations. Second, it offers prospects for increasing overall supply that don't exist for fully exploited wild fisheries. Third, it requires relatively little capital investment, so it's a versatile and viable approach for diversifying livelihoods for poor people. And as an added bonus, mollusk culture is among the most environmentally benign forms of food production, relying as it does on the natural productivity of the ocean to supply the food on which they grow. For some countries, especially those in the developed world, there's also the potential to tap into opportunities for innovation that culture-based production allows. It's perfectly reasonable, for example, to expect that we might develop cultured strains that are less susceptible to acidification, or to develop means for locally modifying water chemistry. This kind of study is important because it seeks to explicitly and quantitatively link effects that are somewhat removed from our immediate concern, the thickness of a mollusk's shell, to much more concrete effects on human well-being, how much food will be available. Making these connections is essential for developing the evidence base to help support policy dialogue and decision-making. Of course, ocean acidification is only one of several stressors acting on marine ecosystems. Nutrient runoff from the land, increases in water temperatures, pollution from coastal developments, changes in freshwater runoff patterns, all of these are likely to change in coming years and affect the food supplies from our coastal waters. But fortunately, many of the coping strategies I described earlier are broadly similar no matter what the major stresses turn out to be, or where you live. So whether it's oysters for that special occasion, or a clam stew to feed the family, the answers are there. We just need to act.
If you've got any comments or feedback for Steve on this podcast, please go to blog.worldfishcenter.org and post them to the blog. Or email expiscor@worldfishcenter.org. Also, be sure to find us on iTunes and subscribe to this podcast.